I've been asked to share with you a little bit about Celebrate Recovery. So I'll give you a little history first. Celebrate Recovery is it's a Christ-centered recovery ministry that uses the 12 steps of recovery, but from the very beginning, we claim Jesus Christ is our higher power. Celebrate Recovery started 29 years ago at Saddleback Church in Las Vegas, and our founder, John Baker, he had been in secular recovery. He had had a lifelong struggle with alcoholism, and it had taken its toll on his family, and it had separated him and his wife and his children. Through the steps of secular recovery, he came to a place where he needed to make amends with his family. They had been separated. His wife, Cheryl, and their children welcomed John back into the family, and they started going to church at Saddleback Church. And as John was working these steps, he found that he was in this place where he knew that he could not be the only one in a church that was going through the struggles that he was going through. That there were so many other people that were like him that couldn't openly talk about the things that they needed to talk about to have the relationship with Jesus that they were supposed to have, that Jesus intended for them to have all along. And so he wrote a 13-page, single-spaced letter to Rick Warren with the idea of Celebrate Recovery, that we could have a ministry inside of a church where we could talk about the things that kept us from the life that God intended for us to have. And so he wrote Rick Warren this letter, and Rick Warren read it, and he called John Baker into his office, and he says, "This sounds like an amazing idea. Why don't you do it, John?" And so Celebrate Recovery began. And so here we are today, some 29 years later, and Celebrate Recovery is in over 30,000 churches in the United States alone. And millions of lives have been transformed because of the tools that we find in this recovery program, but also because of the relationship that we gain with Jesus Christ. Families have been restored. Lives that could have never been dreamed of become a reality. I call Celebrate Recovery a ministry of miracles, a ministry where, again, we begin to realize that God is a God of miracles, and that He intended for us to be one. A little bit about my own story. My father, my earthly father, was a raging alcoholic and a very violent man. And for the first 4 years of my life, I lived a life that no child should ever have to live, filled with abuse. I saw things that nobody should ever have to see. There's things that we can never unsee. And so I was broken as a very young boy. And at 5 years old, my mom left my father, and we moved in to a new apartment complex, and my mom brought a new man into my life who was an amazing man. But at this new apartment complex, we moved right next to a little Baptist church, and I met Jesus Christ at that church. And Jesus took his arms and he wrapped them around this broken little boy, and he drew him in, and he saved my life. I stayed at that church from 5 years old until I was 12 years old. I went to Sunday school and to church every Sunday. I went to Awana every Wednesday, and I fell madly in love with Jesus Christ. But then at the age of 12, my mom got a divorce. You see, I'm a professional stepchild. My mom's been married 5 times. My dad has been married 3 times. And so at 12 years old, we moved away from this church, and I moved away from the life that I had known, which included church, which included Jesus. And I began to live in the world. And so I spent most of my life living in the world. And then things would go bad, and then I'd remember who Jesus was, and I'd go back like a foxhole prayer, "Please save me. I promise I'll never do it again." But I'd end up back, right back into the world over and over and over again. But what I want to tell you is that through all my running and through all my turning away from Jesus, that God never moved. Not one time did he ever move. Another thing I want to tell you is that through my broken life, the thing that I longed for the most was to have my own family. I wanted to have a wife that I could never leave and that I could love. I wanted to have children that I could raise and be the dad that I never had. And you see, God is a God who loves us, and he is a God of miracles, and he gave me those things. He gave me an amazing wife, and he gave me 2 beautiful children. But I had never learned how to deal with my brokenness. And so I inflicted upon my family the same things that I promised that I never would. Now, I never left them, but I was a drug addict for 20 years. And I was an alcoholic for a long time. And then one day, I walked back into a church, a little tiny church in Empire, California. And God met me right there. And this church had a family, and they welcomed me in, and I became a part of that family. And one day, pastor stood up in front of the congregation, and he said, "We want to start a Celebrate Recovery here. Is there anybody here who would like to help?" And so at that time, I was living the life of a Sunday Christian and a 6-day drunk. And I got to tell you, it It was like God grabbed me by the back of my shirt and by the back of my pants, and he threw me into the aisle. And at that moment, my whole life began to change. I began to pursue recovery. Every one of us, in some way, shape, or form, are carrying a weight that we don't need to carry. Hebrews 12:1, it talks about us stripping off anything that hinders us from running the race that God has intended for us to run. What is getting in your way of fully living the life that God has created for you to have? Here at Celebrate Recovery, we learn how to identify what that is. We gain tools, and we learn to trust Jesus to remove it. So it is my hope and it is my prayer that you will give this ministry a chance. I could have never dreamed of this life. But you see, God's plans are above our plans, right? His ways are not our ways, and his thoughts are not our thoughts. What does he have planned for you? You can find out. God bless you. Take care.